Welcome to the Ashford Teaching and Learning Conference. My name is Catherine Myers, and I will be your host for this session. I'm excited to introduce Student Over-Disclosure in the Online Classroom, From Research to Practice, presented by Yolanda Harper, who is an Associate Professor at Ashford University. The chat window will be open during this session for your questions and comments, as well as a short Q&A at the close of the session. Now, without further ado, Yolanda Harper.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending our session on student over-disclosure. I'm Yolanda Harper, and I'll be facilitating our discussion today. I do want to say that Dr. Gesn sends his regrets. He started a new full-time job since we submitted the proposal, and his schedule will not allow him to be away at this time. However, he was my co-researcher on the original research project investigating how students and faculty evaluate students who over-disclose. Again, I'm Yolanda. I teach courses in the College of Health, Human Services, and Science, particularly courses in psychology and applied behavioral sciences, as well as a course called Cultural Awareness in the Human Services. I am remote, and I live in Tennessee, and I've been with Ashford for 3 years after having worked in private and public universities, primarily in the southern and central United States. Now, I'd love to get to know a little bit about you. If you would, tell us your name, the college you're aligned with, and your location. And of course, if you entered this particular session with your name, you shouldn't need to type your name again. It should automatically populate. But if you would, just let us know a little bit about yourself. I see multiple people are typing. Fabulous. Welcome, Kimberly from Denver. Wow, South Carolina. Business ethics, great. Got the School of Business. Well, I'm seeing we have a good representation across the university, and I see others are still typing. So continue to let us know who you are in the chat box. And this topic is particularly interesting to me because initially I thought, well, maybe students are just over-disclosing because they're psychology majors. But I found the more that I visited with colleagues across the university that this is an issue that happens in all colleges. And if you would, Catherine, go ahead and put up the first poll. I want to find out from you how often you have students who over-disclose personally sensitive information in your classes. So over half are saying occasionally, and a few, about 12%, one person has very frequently. Great. Thank you all for sharing that information. Okay, we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. And if you're sharing about yourself, please continue to do so. Okay. Now, our topic for this session is actually in response to challenges reported by faculty when students overshare personal information in class. I'm going to begin with a very brief overview of the research findings from our project, Perceptions of Appropriate and Inappropriate Student Self-Disclosure. And then the rest of the time, we're going to spend discussing a theoretical framework for understanding instructor strategies to over-disclosure, followed by dialogues in which we will all respond to various over-disclosure scenarios. Now, some of you may have attended one of our research presentations last spring where Dr. Gesn and I presented the results of our study that we conducted here at Ashford University. In our study, we presented students and faculty with examples of student discussion post responses and had the study participants rate the posts and the student authors on a number of dimensions. To put our study into some context, the level of student self-disclosure in campus-based college classes has been shown to impact students' perceptions of their classmates with high levels of inappropriate disclosure having a negative impact on perceptions. Beliefs about what fosters student engagement in online courses have led to this trend for instructors to attempt to incorporate, more authentic and more integrative assignments in their classes. These types of assignments do require students to make connections more explicitly between the course material, theory and research, and real-world settings. Melanie Booth observed that students are often encouraged to draw on their own life experiences in order to make the course material personally relevant to them. And to many, this encourages a certain level of self-disclosure. And without explicit guidelines from the instructor, some students may disclose information that their classmates or their instructors find too personal and inappropriate for a college class. This is the short and sweet summary of the research findings and the findings of prior research. And of course, if you're interested in the full-length version of our research presentation, email me and I'll be happy to send you the PowerPoint and just, chat with you also personally about any questions you might have. Now, Frisbee and Seidlinger's work, whose research actually inspired our study, found that students who were rated as inappropriate self-disclosures were evaluated more negatively by their classmates in terms of competence and social attraction. Their study was based on face-to-face interactions in a campus-based classroom. In our study, we found that students, for the most part, separated the response from the student as long as the student answered the question or the discussion prompt with relevant academic content. Ratings of competency and self-attraction were more influenced by the academic content than the personal disclosure level for students. Now, faculty, on the other hand, rated high disclosures as inappropriate, less competent, and less socially attractive, even if they answered the discussion prompt with accurate and relevant academic context. Faculty also assigned lower letter grades to discussion posts with high levels of inappropriate self-disclosure. So here we just have a quick visual summary of some of the findings from our study. Again, these are just the highlights. We had lots of variables that we actually looked at. So again, if you want more information, feel free to contact me later. So now the remainder of our session is going to be dedicated to information pertinent to actually responding to student over-disclosure. Okay. The model we're going to use to organize potential faculty responses to student over-disclosure has two primary dimensions, empowering and enabling. To empower a student is to provide a response that helps students to learn to better self-manage their emotions and make improved judgments about what is socially appropriate to share in an online classroom as a model of a professional environment. To enable a student in this model is to provide a response that encourages or reinforces inappropriate behavior. And then there are also responses that neither consciously seek to empower nor to enable, but simply avoid addressing the disclosure altogether, which could have the impact of empowering or enabling, depending on the student and the context of the disclosure, as well as how other students respond in the classroom. Now, actually, the addictions literature has given the word enabling the negative connotation that we're using here, that it doesn't always have in all contexts. To enable is traditionally defined as to provide resources, authority, or an opportunity to do something. However, when enabling is used in the negative sense, it is to enable a person to do something that is not ultimately in her or his best interest. So enabling in academia can be reinforced by well-meaning faculty who unwittingly allow or encourage students' inappropriate behaviors, shielding them from the consequences of their actions or fostering dependence on faculty as the final authority, thus inhibiting the critical thinking aspects of learning. The faculty behaviors described here encourage or support situations that are potentially destructive for students. Now there can be a fine line, as you can imagine, between helping and enabling. So don't get me wrong, the desire to help others is often a very noble and very important part of our calling to teach. But the ultimate goal is to help in ways that really help and help them be more successful ultimately in the workplaces that they go. When we choose to engage in the behaviors on this screen, we may tell ourselves that our intent is to help. However, we're often hurting more than we're helping. It can be helpful to remind ourselves that a very important part of our role is to prepare students to be successful in the workplace, and two key institutional outcomes toward that end for Ashford students are to demonstrate the ability to read and think critically and creatively, and to demonstrate the ability to communicate effectively in speech and in writing. People are often fired or otherwise unsuccessful on their jobs due to deficits in interpersonal skills despite having the required credentials. Okay. Empowerment, on the other hand, can provide resources and conditions to increase student effectiveness. In 1996, Worrell and colleagues proposed a model for empowerment which Ashford and Shanta expanded upon, and this model suggests that the critical elements of empowerment rely not only on the process of being empowered, but also on the actual outcome of empowerment. The model lists 4 critical components. I'm getting ahead of myself. Actually, I'd like to hear from you on this particular poll question. If you would let us know how frequently do you respond in an empowering manner to students? Awesome. So our discussion in this session is going to be great because it looks like that is definitely our orientation as faculty, which makes sense. Okay, great. Thank you all. Okay, so now to the model. So the model here has 4 critical components: collegiality, communication, autonomy, and accountability. And the model here I chose because it's actually used in education to differentiate empowering versus enabling in teaching strategies and faculty-student interactions and in training practica. So let's start with collegiality. Faculty who enable students will take care of them rather than foster independence. Their highest priority is pleasing the students. They tell students what they want to hear rather than what they need to hear. And telling students what they want to hear, whether or not it's accurate, can send mixed messages about professional values and ethics. In contrast, when a faculty member seeks to empower students, honest feedback is given to students in order to encourage their growth. Now, we can give the feedback, with care and compassion, but yet the feedback is still honest. An example of increasing collegiality would be modifying the role of the educator from that of the sole provider of information to that of a coach. Okay, so our next component here is communication. Communication in an enabling environment focuses on faculty providing information one way without the opportunity for student exchange. In an empowering classroom, student participation, critical thinking, and ultimately synthesis are all encouraged. Autonomy can be achieved through the development and use of problem-solving skills, and faculty who enable students do not encourage or facilitate students' development of problem-solving skills in the classroom. And then although accountability is last to be discussed here, it is perhaps the most important to true empowerment. Instead of helping students take control of their own lives, those who enable students make excuses for the students' lack of preparation or for the incomplete written assignments. By accepting or the use of excuses that students have so many obligations at home or at their place of employment, faculty take accountability away from students. Faculty who do not require students to be culpable for deadlines or written assignments or attendance may hinder students' development of accountability and responsibility, which reduces or restricts the emergence of professional and political skills. Now, in extreme cases, faculty might feel driven to offer unsolicited advice or to act on behalf of students who are actually capable of acting for themselves. These faculty, in extreme cases, do so because they want to be needed by students and act as caretakers and regularly solve problems for students rather than coaching the students through the problem-solving process. In contrast, professional accountability will emerge when we choose intentional strategies to facilitate students' development of introspection, problem-solving skills, and assertiveness. Okay. And another enabling behavior that instructors can engage in is over-disclosing themselves about their own lives, which can have significant negative impacts on classroom attitudes and student behavior. Okay. Now, many of us have found that when students are invited to write about their personal experiences, some choose to relate traumatic incidents and situations. In an online course, these experiences may be shared in the discussion board, and as well as written assignments in emails or phone conversations. Over-disclosure can impact learning if a faculty member feels too uncomfortable because of the information shared to actually then critique factual errors, content errors, grammatical errors, etc. In this case, over-identification with the student prevents the instructor from providing the needed constructive feedback. So it's very important not to let the content of the disclosures impact grading in a positive or negative manner. Now, McDavid presents two ends of a spectrum of faculty responses and recommends faculty, tactfully speaking our minds. McDavid recommends using I statements instead of you statements and gives an example, such as, I felt uneasy after reading your essay about cutting. I feel like I'm intruding asking this, but are you in danger of committing suicide? So this is much easier for a student to hear rather than, you sound pretty disturbed. Are you trying to think about killing yourself? So what are your thoughts, if you would share with me in the chat, about this particular approach? It's one author's opinion, and it may not fit everyone. Okay, thanks, Elizabeth, for your comments. And of course, the recommendation is to say, whatever we're going to say in a way that feels authentic to our own personalities. Okay. Now, Mary Valentino gives an example of the use of I statements, talking with a student who had written a traumatic incident, and Valentino asked if the student first is writing a fictional piece. The student responded, no, and then Valentino volunteers, I wasn't sure how you wanted me to respond. So this particular I statement is almost similar to a question in that it displays uncertainty and perhaps an openness to a response, but it doesn't absolutely direct or demand a response from the student. So it gives that student the option of whether or not to respond further or not. Oh, okay. Thank you, Dario, for your comments as well, that asking the question can lead to prevention. Okay, so let's start looking at some scenarios. Regardless of the disclosure, our role is the same, to maintain an environment that promotes student learning. Treating students with respect is going to always be the most important response. It can be helpful to take note of whether your default reaction lies at either extreme of the spectrum of enmeshment to disengagement. and then decide whether or not you want to share an honest and supportive personal reaction in the form of an iMessage. A good question I always ask myself is, what would be the most empowering option? And depending on the scenario, sometimes the most empowering option is to not respond directly to the over-disclosure. And in other cases, to make some kind of acknowledgement may be empowering for the student. So if you would, take some time and look at the first scenario. This is one was left in the Ask Your Instructor page, but it could have been in an email as well. Many of you may have received similar types of emails. And share with us, and I think the phone lines are open or can be open, so you're welcome to share with us in the chat or by the phone how you would respond to Diane.
Unfortunately, we can't have the phone lines open. All of the audience members have been muted on our end, but absolutely, let's talk about this scenario in the chat.
Okay, thanks for that, Catherine.
Yolanda, have you had this scenario for a real one, or did you kind of just make this up for today? Because it seems like it could be something that we would read in the AYI.
Yeah, all of the scenarios have been adapted from real scenarios that either Dr. Gesn, myself, or other faculty that we've worked with have received. We've, changed some identifying information, gender, certain things like that. But they're all based on real scenarios.
It makes me so sad that this is based on a real scenario, because things like this do happen.
Absolutely.
But thankfully, I guess in this case, because they, overshared, we can get them the help that they need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in this particular one, notice that it was offered on the Ask Your Instructor page, which not every student in the class will see it, but there is the potential for every student to see it. And clearly the faculty members saw it. This is a case where I think it's more appropriate to just respond on the Ask Your Instructor page, that I'll send you an email, or if a student had left a phone number, and the faculty member wanted to call, they could certainly say, I'll return your call or something. And to take this particular one offline, how many of you would let the student retake the test? And there's no right or wrong answer, And I know we all make these decisions on a case-by-case basis.
Well, I see a lot of people typing in. This is great.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I really want this to be interactive, because we all have different approaches. We have different personality styles, and we learn from each other. So right now, more people would allow the student to retake the test. Okay. And thanks, Lisa, for mentioning the policy about lateness, because allowing someone to retake the test, if you wanted to still assign some type of late penalty, there's no reason why that's not possible. So that would be a personal choice. And depending on, in a real classroom, typically we have even more context, If this were week 1, we may not know much about the student, but if this had happened like week 4 or 5, then we may have more data, more to help us make a decision about whether or not a late penalty on top of retaking the test would be appropriate or not, or empowering or not. Well, thank you all for your comments. And, you know, the chat is open, so feel free to continue to share your ideas. Now, Branch and colleagues surveyed faculty and found that the majority of faculty members in their sample reported receiving numerous student disclosures of sexual assault or interpersonal violence victimization throughout their careers. So that was kind of one of the reasons I asked earlier about how often we get over disclosures. And these particular researchers found that those topics were very commonly disclosed. They found that it was also common for faculty as a result to make changes to the way they conduct their classes as a result of student over-disclosure. So faculty are impacted by the student disclosures as well. Some faculty started to warn students if it was a class that the topic was already a sensitive topic, like a trauma class or victimization class, or there were other themes that would often serve as stimuli that's leading students to over-disclose. Some faculty began to warn students about the course content. There are other faculty who warned the students that the classroom is not a safe environment for disclosure of personally sensitive information and that they should not expect all students to keep the information they share as private or confidential. Some professors instruct their students not to make any personal disclosures in the class. And so through their research, these authors found that although after many years of teaching and many years of hearing disclosures or seeing disclosures, that it's very common for faculty to begin to think students are lying about these life circumstances in order to get out of an exam or to get an extension on an assignment. But the researchers here found that, first of all, not all students who disclosed personally sensitive situations even asked for consideration with grades or assignments. So it's not necessarily the case that that is the reason for disclosure. Okay, I see your comment, Risa, about wondering if it would be appropriate to have the comment removed. And that was something you could certainly talk with your FSDA about, particularly after you've already responded to the student offline. You certainly could do that. Okay. Our next poll, have you changed your teaching as a result of receiving sensitive self-disclosures? And changing teaching might include, you know, like the examples I gave earlier, creating an announcement, a reminder, some coaching, something. So it's not necessarily just changing how we grade or respond to students. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for those who chose to participate in the poll. So some have made some changes, and some have more who responded had not. Okay. So if you were going to craft a message for students to caution them from disclosing inappropriate information in the discussion forum, what would you say? What would be key components that you would want to communicate to students?
This is an excellent question to ask. I honestly don't even know how I would do that. So I'm looking forward to seeing everyone's responses.
Oh, I like that. Trade secrets. Thank you, Elizabeth, for sharing that. I should not tell any trade secrets. And I'm sure that language speaks, particularly it resonates for business majors and understand exactly what you mean by that. Yeah, so letting them know that you can't control where the information goes from there, yeah. Oh, Lance, thank you. That was a very creative idea. So taking the screenshot and then deleting the offending post. So there's a record that allows you to communicate with the student, and at the same time, it's not just out there indefinitely for another student to copy and paste. Okay. So reminding, Catherine reminds the students of the policy. Okay. Try to read the chat. These are all fabulous comments. Thank you all so much for sharing that.
You've really kind of charged our brains this morning with this because, again, there are things that I think as a group, faculty, all of you don't really get together to talk about scenarios like this. So this is great.
Okay. And okay, reminding the student that some things cross the line. So Lance, that's a great example of coaching the student because you're thinking again ahead to how, if they continue that behavior, what the real world implications might be as well. And so that, Lance, you were a great segue to my second question. What types of general coaching would be helpful to students to empower healthy, effective, professional, and socially appropriate communication? So, and we heard the trade secrets was a good phrase, and if a student did want to know more about that, we could then provide examples of ways that they might disclose or what they might share in a way that, because there are personal life experiences that could be relevant to the academic content, but students might need some assistance or some coaching in how do I phrase this in a way to tie it to the academic content, which parts of this experience are actually relevant and which parts are not relevant, which parts actually distract from the connection of the theory, the practice to real world, this conversation. Okay. And I saw several, comments earlier about taking the conversations offline or in an email. I think the email is beneficial because they are writing the initial disclosures usually in our online classes. We can provide a written model as well, and in email there is also documentation that we have as well of what transpired in terms of the communication. And that same type of documentation, doesn't exist if we have a phone conversation with them. Okay, so what types of general coaching? Anyone else want to share how they might coach? And we'll have some more scenarios to address, so keep these two questions in mind as we look at some of the other scenarios. Guiding the student back to the discussion topic. Great. Thank you, April. Question, and also April talked about asking follow-up questions related to the discussion topic that encourages the students to respond with more relevant classroom discussion. I'm so glad you said that, April. That is a fabulous strategy. I do that as well because sometimes students get so distracted in their over-disclosures that they miss addressing the content, and they also miss out on potential grade points by doing so. And so those type of questions, they kind of direct them back to the academic content. They may not earn the full credit because they didn't put that content in their initial post, but I will give them credit back for including accurate academic content in a follow-up response to my question. Okay, thank you all. Scenario 2. So after missing discussion posts and assignments for weeks 3 and 4, Dante sends you this email. which basically he, says he wasn't in class because he attempted suicide. And notice Dante is not asking for anything. How would you respond?
Wow, I'm reading this and out loud in the room. I'm just like, oh my gosh.
Okay. Yeah, Catherine, it's always good to check back with the policies. And I'm actually going to share a resource, several resources we have on campus to assist us as well, and one in particular that is helpful for student over-disclosures. So I see that the trend is to actually, consult with a colleague. We have our SSDAs to assist us through this process before we would respond. The nice thing about email communications like this is we have some time to reflect a little bit and to consult with others. If you think about the previous author's recommendations, we could certainly respond with an I statement. I'm not sure how you would like me to respond to this. As a faculty member who also does instructional quality reviews, I've actually seen some students disclose information like this, and I've seen responses from faculty such as, I'm sorry you had that experience, and then directing the conversation back to the content in an email. That could also be an appropriate response if you wanted to, if that felt authentic for you. Passing the information on, asking for help. Yeah. Student access and wellness would certainly be an appropriate response. And as a spoiler to a slide we'll get to much later, we also have student advocates that could help us in that as well. Okay. And these are just some responses that we've gotten from colleagues, such as yourself, when we've done other versions of the research presentation about how they respond to student over-disclosure. So we just collected some of them that many of you might have said, many of you have said similar things too, and may be able to relate to. And I see a theme in these particular responses, about focusing on the academic content, helping to coach students about what is appropriate. One faculty member basically didn't know what to say. Sometimes, there's a saying, if you don't know what to say nothing. At least when you first, to give yourself some time to reflect to see if there is anything more to say. And this particular faculty member, when the disclosure happened in class, said, I didn't have a response, and kind of let the conversation die. I think, as I said earlier, doing nothing can be an empowering response, or it can be an enabling response. It just kind of depends. If the faculty member says nothing, and then you have 3 or 4 other students jump in with a extremely over-identified enabling response, then the result is that the behavior has been enabled. So if we choose, not to respond, it's still a good idea to keep an eye on the discussion board to see what else is happening. And in this particular case, nothing much else happened. There was no response from other students. I actually had a student over-disclose some information, sexual assault in the class, and the students who responded to her post did not respond to that content. They responded to the academic content, and the student was so upset that she sent me an email and said, well, it's obvious no one in this class has ever been sexually assaulted because of the way they responded to my discussion post. So I went and looked to see how the students responded to her post. And, after I could assess it, she was okay. But she was disturbed by the lack of sympathy that was communicated. I was actually able to coach with her about her critical thinking in response. She made an assumption that no one had ever had a similar experience based on those responses. But that was not my first line of communication with her. The first line was, making sure that she was actually okay before finding out if she was now in a place where she could be coached through the critical thinking and what might be some other reasons why students might have chosen to respond to your post in that particular way. Okay, so these are some more responses from some of our colleagues. Having the offline conversation, many of you have said that. And then one faculty member talks about his own personal challenge with this, part of them wanting to tell them it's inappropriate but not wanting to hurt them or damage them any further. And many do remind them, well, I'm not a therapist, this is as far as I can take you in this conversation. And I do remind students of that sometimes, I'm not a therapist. Okay. All right, so this is one that was in the discussion board, and the students were required to talk about nature versus nurture. And again, I'd love to hear from you. I really wish we could have had the phone lines open so I could hear your voices. But I really would love to hear from you how you would respond to this scenario. And while I'm giving people time to type, I'm going to try to catch up on some of the chat that I've missed.
And while people are typing in the responses, and Yolanda, you're reading over there what they've written, just wanted to remind the group we have just under 8 minutes left before we have to end and get ready for the next session.
Okay, thanks for that reminder. That's interesting, Catherine, about discouraging from referring someone to a suicide line. And certainly we felt that, again, a spoiler for later on, but this will be a great opportunity to do a warm transfer to maybe a student advocate. And the other part of the question is not just how would you respond to the over-disclosure, but again, the topic is nature versus nurture. How much does genetics or biology contribute to one's, say, mental illness or circumstances versus environment? How about the academic content? Is there enough there in this response where you felt like, well, they did address the content? Or did they just use the words and then kind of go off on their personal story? Okay. I'm going to, please continue to share. I'm going to move on. Catherine has given us the reminder. I'll just kind of say some general comments about this, and if something strikes you that you are willing to share with us all, please do so. So this is actually the bottom half of a student's response, and the discussion topic students were asking to share in two sides of a controversy about whether or not the pharmaceutical industry has the consumer's best interest in mind. And this particular student started with two paragraphs that I would say are A+ academic content related to discussion. So they're the lovely citations and really addressing both sides of the controversy with clear, well-written academic content. And then, after the student got that part done, the student discloses this information about herself or himself. Thank you for your comment, Fred. Yes, that is a question that many faculty do ask. How do we know that they're telling the truth? And it seemed like from the research of the author that we reviewed earlier that after many years of seeing and hearing so many disclosures, many faculty just kind of adopt a default, well, I don't know if they're telling the truth, and respond as if they're not, or as a way to kind of distance themselves from the content, because ultimately we don't know. If a student is asking for some type of, extension on time, we still don't know if they're telling the truth or not. But there does seem to be a large number of scenarios out there in which students over-disclose and they don't ask for anything. Now, are they assuming that they'll get special consideration without asking? Some might not. We don't know that. We could always, thank you, Catherine, for your question. We can always consult with colleagues. Having a diagnosis is not necessarily a disability, but the staff in that area do have information that can be helpful and can talk us through a lot of these scenarios. In this particular case, as I mentioned, the student gave an A+ response at the top half of the post, and then began with this particular information. So one option would be, there was plenty of information in the top half of the post that the faculty member could respond just to that and not respond to the over-disclosure if chosen. And the student, from other pieces of data throughout the course, appeared to be actually a high-functioning student. Lisa said, I would thank them for sharing their personal experience, but then focus, on the discussion answer. Yeah, thank you. So again, not necessarily. We just want to hear from all of you. I'm going to go ahead and, I think for lack of time, skip through this one. But if anybody wants the whole PowerPoint, I think we can make that available easily. See how much time do you have? How much actual live time do we have, Catherine?
I was actually going to jump in. We have 1 minute to end.
Okay.
So response to your question, just to let everyone know, everyone will have this been recorded, so everyone will have access to listen to the talk, and then they will be able to see your PowerPoint slide. Everything will be saved for the audience.
Okay. Thank you. So I do want to just remind us of the resources here at Ashford, and the one that may be most relevant to this particular conversation is the Student Advocate Helpline. This is a staff-facing resource, as it says, and so it's for us to use to reach out to find information. It's available in the CETL, and these are the type of themes and topics that they most frequently assist with. We can also do a warm transfer if necessary to that extension if we're actually talking to a student who seems to be in an imminent crisis, to the 4357. Now, this is for students that we feel have communicated that they're actually in imminent crisis. And so I'm hearing some talking in the background, so I assume that we're out of time. I do have some information about faculty self-care, because one of the reasons oftentimes we do start to doubt whether or not they're telling the truth could be that we've heard so many stories that there's some vicarious traumatization that has gone on. Keeping in mind that overall, the students might be struggling with a lot. They may have gone through a lot, but most of them are generally okay functioning. Many are talking about things in the past and do not identify with that trauma 100% of the time.
Okay, hi, Yolanda. Sorry, I have to jump in. I just want to say, I've chimed in when you were speaking. I'm sitting here nodding my head, writing notes down. Thank you so much for sharing with us. It looks like everyone really enjoyed talking about these different scenarios. You've really kind of given us stuff to think about. So I want to thank you, Yolanda Harper, for your presentation. Thank you to everyone who attended. This presentation will be available for viewing in the CETL soon, and we'll send out an email to everyone when those live sessions are available. Don't forget to go to the TLC app and rate this session, and then use the link in the room. It's right below this presentation. Use that link to do a quick end-of-session survey. And then finally, look for an overall end-of-conference survey to provide more in-depth feedback. Thank you all for your participation. Yolanda, you were wonderful, great content. I wish you all a wonderful day, and we have a few minutes for you to get off to the next session. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.